Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am Sophia. If you have been here for a while, you will know that this channel has explored quite a few different things over the years. I've explored mediumship, healing, meditation, spirituality, and our connection to something beyond what we can see. This has run parallel to a traveling journey I have been on for almost 10 years. But today I want to talk to you about a new chapter, a chapter that in many ways has been unfolding for me for quite some time. And it has brought me to a subject that we don't always like to talk about. Over the past year, I have been thinking deeply about death, and I think I need to share a little bit about why. The end of last year brought quite a profound period of change into my life. I've experienced the loss of two very dear family members, a miscarriage, and at around the same time, I also went through the experience of changing countries. And although moving to another country isn't a death in the literal sense, in many ways it felt like one. Because when you leave one life behind and begin again somewhere completely different, so many parts of who you were have to change. Some things are left behind, some relationships change, and some identities really no longer fit. I have come to see some dreams that had to be released, but also some old parts of me, in a sense, needed to die so that something new can begin. I found myself experiencing many different kinds of endings at the same time. There was the very real and painful experience of losing people I loved. There was the grief that came with those losses. And there was also the strange, complicated grief of leaving behind a life, a place, and versions of myself that I had known for so many years. And I think all of that brought me much closer to a subject of death, and not just death itself, but dying, the grief, the loss. These transitions we experience through our lives. For many years, through my work with mediumship, I have been connecting with people who have already transitioned. I have spent a lot of time exploring that side of the experience, the connection we can continue to feel with someone we have loved and who has died, the relationship that can continue in different ways, and the possibility that our connection with someone doesn't necessarily end when their physical life does. But this time I found myself looking at it from a slightly different perspective. I got to switch the lens, and instead of looking primarily at what happens after someone has died, this time I became much more curious about what happens before that transition. We tend to think about death as something that happens only at the very end of life, but I have started to see that there are many smaller deaths throughout our lives. Outgrowing identities, living places, relationships that end, people that we love that die. The person we were once changes, and sometimes we have to grieve those endings before we can fully step into whatever comes next. I think that experience changed something in me, but most importantly, it brought to light an action I wish I had for many years to create a space where we don't have to be so afraid of talking about it. And this is also what led me to something that has become a very important part of my journey and that today I want to share with you. I've recently graduated as a death doula, or how some other platforms like to call it, an end of life doula. Some of you might feel surprised by it and question why this. Why the shift from mediumship, healing, and meditation towards death and grief? Well, For me, these things aren't actually as separate as they might appear. My work with mediumship has always brought me into questions about life, death, consciousness, connection, and what might exist beyond what we can see. And through many years of supporting clients through readings, I began to notice something that was a common thread in my work. It wasn't always so much about the connection itself, but very often it was about presence. It was about creating a space where there was an opportunity for something to be spoken that perhaps had never been spoken, for something that had been carried silently to finally be heard, and even for memories to be shared, for love to be expressed, and most of all, for grief to have a place to come in again, perhaps changing something inside, even if only for a moment, because every time revisiting grief is a new part of the grief process. Sometimes it came through a tear, sometimes I saw people smiling, sometimes I saw them going through a sweet memory that hadn't been visited in a long time. I'm exploring now another part of that same journey, a place where we can have honest conversations about death, dying, grief, and loss, but also about life. We will explore what it means to die well, with autonomy. We will talk about the end of life experience and what supporting someone who is dying can look like. We will talk about grief, including the kinds of grief that aren't always talked about, like, for example, anticipatory grief, the grief that can begin before someone actually dies. We will also talk about how to support someone who has lost a loved one. And we will talk about conversations around death that many families avoid until it's too late, about rituals, remembrance, spirituality, and meaning, about the fear of death, and about something that I think it is just as important, which is how thinking about death can actually change the way we live. Often, grief has been associated with something we need to move on from. But I don't think that's how grief works. We don't necessarily leave grief behind, we learn to carry it. And grief can look so different from one person to another. This is not an absolute truth to everyone. But I will share a little bit of my experience. I was only 14 when my grandfather died. This was perhaps my first closer death, not only in the way we were connected, but also in the way he departed. I was honored with the gift of being by his side, and still today I remember. Um, it's like grief never finished. I I just learned to live with his absence, but I can still deeply miss him and be touched with a smile or a tear from it. This is to me a fundamental part as well of many stories we shared in the training I just did at Inelda. Grief is much more than just sadness and just anger and guilt or numbness or relief. And many times it's all of those things in the same day. Ultimately, I have come to believe that grief is not something that exists outside of life. And it is deeply human part of our existence and a reflection of how complex, profound, and meaningful our capacity to love can be. Because of my background in mediumship and spirituality, there will naturally also be conversations about those aspects of death. But I want to approach these conversations with openness and respect. I don't believe we all need to have the same beliefs about what happens before or after we die. And so for me, this new chapter isn't really about trying to define what we should believe about death or what comes after it. It's more about asking a different question. What can connect us through this experience? What can support us when someone is dying? What can support the person who is approaching the end of life and the person who loved them? What can help us feel less alone when we are facing something that is ultimately part of being human? There is room here for different beliefs, different experiences, and different ways of understanding death. We don't always need an answer, and sometimes we simply need someone willing to sit beside us in the question. Perhaps this is what I find most interesting about talking about death. It doesn't necessarily have to be a morbid topic. In fact, I think talking honestly about death can bring us closer to life. When we remember that our time here is not infinite, perhaps we become more present. And today I want to leave you with a few questions, not necessarily questions that need an immediate answer, but perhaps questions that you can carry with you, sit with it, or even explore in your journal. Don't worry, I will write them down in the description below. And the questions I want to share with you is what really matters to me? How do I want to live? Who and what do I want to make more space for in my life? What do I want to leave behind? And perhaps when we allow ourselves to think a little bit further into the future, how would I want to be cared for when I can no longer care of myself? These aren't always easy questions, and I understand feelings that might arrive to you. And that's perhaps part of why we don't ask them very often. But I think there can be something deeply valuable in giving ourselves permission to explore them. This is part of what this new chapter is about, creating space for conversations that we don't always know how to have, that we don't always feel we can have. And perhaps by becoming a little bit more comfortable talking about death, we can become a little bit more present as well, intentional and connected to the life we are living now. So if you have been here for a long time, thank you so much. Thank you for being part of this journey and for allowing this space to evolve with me. And if you are new here, welcome. You just arrived at the right time. I hope you will join me for these conversations for the new projects that will come in. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.